Okay, well, thank you so much for coming. Welcome, everybody. And it's really such an honor and such a pleasure to see you here. It took a long time to prepare this event. And thanks, of course, to Shilai Temple, to Fogwan-san, to University of the West, to our CIO, our president, to everybody who helped to make this workshop possible. Of course, Sung was of maybe the most essential person here. I feel like I really abused him, so giving him so much work. So I will just say very few words because I don't want to bore you too much. Just like maybe a little bit about the Institute and also about University of the West. The promotion of education is, of course, one of the pillars of Fogwan-san, of University of the West, and of the Institute too. And ISHB, our Institute for the Study of Humanistic Buddhism. And that is, of course, even more so true after Venerable Master Hsing entered Parinirvana in this spring. So we're taking over the porch and trying to continue to promote student excellence, research education, because we think an important aspect of humanistic Buddhism is really the engagement also with the scholarly world and having Buddhist institutions themselves being engaged in research, not just secular universities researching Buddhists, but Buddhists being a part of research on Buddhism, having a voice and within the research on Buddhism. And I will just highlight two small areas where ISHB is engaged in research and education. I'm going to start with our students. So ISHB has launched or initiated an International Student Symposium last spring, in cooperation, of course, with National University of Singapore, National Zhengzhou University, and Fogwan University. We have all the important people here in the room, and I'm very, very grateful for your support and assistance. It's really such a great opportunity for our students to engage, to practice engaging in conferences on an international level in English. So, of course, on Zoom, right, we don't fly people out, but on Zoom, we make it possible for them despite the different time zones. And then, thanks to our CIO, Jane Iwamura, we got funding from the through APARI from the Luz Foundation at Berkeley. So we have another project, it's a student research project on mapping temples in the San Gabriel Valley. There's an enormous wealth of Buddhist culture here in the San Gabriel Valley. There's, of course, Shilai Temple is at the center, at the heart, the biggest of all these temples, but there's many, many more, including, of course, US, also a Buddhist institution, which are completely under-researched. And the project is meant to give our students like an opportunity to practice research practices, ethnography, and fieldwork methods. We are a small school, so we don't have many students. And again, it's Sung. Without Sung, the project wouldn't survive. He's really the heart of the mapping project, and I really hope he takes it over for his PhD thesis. I'm not pressuring him at all. Yes, that's just the two things I want to highlight on our student engagements. Or the student education, but at the heart of the ISHB is, of course, the ISHB mapping group on modern and contemporary Buddhist encounters in the Savant Science sphere. Before I was hired, I had a talk. At the time, President Ta wasn't here yet. I was hired slightly before her, even though she was here before me in person. But our job talks, so to speak, were like a month separate from each other. So right after my job talk, I had a talk on Zoom again with Jane Iwamura, and she suggested really to use the working group format, which is a group format which worked very successfully with APARI, the Asian American and Pacific Islander Religion Initiative here in the US. And I happily took on the idea that it's such a great format to really, create a space that really promotes research, in-depth research on modern Chinese Buddhism, thereby also on humanistic Buddhism. And we tried to make this workshop possible for over 2 years now, 3 years, because the first year I couldn't enter the US. I was stuck in Europe due to COVID, but I was already working on the workshop and the working group. And finally, it's possible. So I'm really, really excited that finally you all jumped on a plane and made it here for like a couple of days to work together and to really forward like the research on modern Chinese Buddhism. And of course, and we all, those of us who followed us, all the members of the working group in the first year, they attended or they gave lectures online on Zoom on their current research. So most of their lectures are on our website or the REL YouTube channel, the ISHB together with the REL talks, but also all the ISHB talks. And this year, we finally have the in-person workshop, which of course starts with Dr. Chia, his very exciting keynote, Lion City Dharma, Humanistic Buddhism in Singapore. But before I ask Dr. Chia to come here, I asked Dr. Ta, which I learned today is also Xie in Mandarin. It's both Xie. So the other Dr. Xie to give some words, then followed by Dr. Iwamura. Thank you so much.
Just want to say a few words. I want to extend a warm welcome to all the scholars who've been traveled here from afar. Thank you so much. From Hong Kong, from Singapore, from Taiwan, if I'm missing any other countries. And I hope that your stay, Canada.
Oh, Italy.
Yes, and I hope that your stay has been enjoyable. I think the sun is coming out to welcome you. We have gloomy day for the last 2 weeks, and finally this afternoon it came out. Tomorrow going to be a warmer day. So you're going to be enjoying the California, Los Angeles sunshine. But first of all, I want to introduce our Venerable Hui Dong from Shilai Temple. Yeah. Venerable Hui Chen. Yeah. And Venerable Hui Zhe. Yes. And without the support of Foguanshan Shilai Temple, we would not be able to have this conference and this meeting. And of course, I was very, very pleased to find my long-lost relative today. And realizing I've been suspect Chia as Xie. So today I finally got confirmed that it's Chia. So it is in Chaozhou, Chia. So I'm also Chaozhou Ren. So I've been suspect. So finally, it's confirmed. So we are long lost brother and sister. Okay. So thank you so much. I heard of you since I came to U.S. Your name, and finally able to meet you in person is my great honor, and to be able to listen to your lecture today. So again, thank you, administrator, staff, student, graduate student, for helping out for this workshop to make it possible. Okay.
Okay, now Dr. Iwamura, I think everybody knows her.
Good afternoon. Welcome our esteemed guest, colleagues, Abbot Hui Dong, venerables, Foguanshan friends, students, and everyone else. I am pleased to welcome you here today for the Venerable Master Hsing Yun Memorial Keynote Lecture. So as many of you know, Venerable Master Hsing Yun took passage on February 5th of this year. His expansive vision and his tireless efforts, underwritten by great compassion and wisdom, is the reason why we are here this afternoon. As many of you know or might not know, University of the West was the first university that Master Hsing Yun established. And this would grow into a vibrant consortium of institutions of higher ed in Taiwan, Hong Kong, Australia, and the Philippines. So with that establishment of the university, he also planted a seed of whole person learning and education for us to use the best of our faculties. And the Institute for the Study of Humanistic Buddhism seeks to do just that, and to provide a scholarly haven in which to understand the many facets of Buddhist history, philosophy, social, and cultural formation. Acculturation, adapting to new environments, or Buddhism adapting to environments, to understand the dynamics and the dynamism of global Buddhism. So Buddhism in the San Gabriel Valley, in Taiwan, China, Europe, and South Africa, in Singapore, recognizing the particularities of perspectives and practices, but also the interconnectedness. This memorial lecture kicks off the Researching Buddhist Mobilities, Terms and Methodologies workshop, a title I know all the scholars in the room appreciate. And we're, again, so happy to have all of you here from the Southern Sinosphere Working Group. We are honored to have all of you again and wish you a very, very productive meeting. Thank you to Dr. Reinke and the ISHB for organizing the lecture and the meeting, and deep appreciation to Jack, Dr. Jack Chia, for his insights today into humanistic Buddhism in Singapore. Welcome all.
Without further ado, please, Dr. Chia. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, Venerables, President Ta, Dr. Iwamura, Dr. Jens Ranker, distinguished colleagues and friends, a very good afternoon to all of you. I want to begin by thanking Jens for organizing this wonderful workshop and for putting together the working group. And it's a really wonderful pleasure to be working with you and many colleagues over the last 2 years. So this is also a wonderful time that for us to get together and also to, I would probably say, to give thanks to the late Venerable Master Hsing, as what Dr. Iwamura mentioned earlier, that to thank him for his contribution to education and also research in Buddhist studies. So this is a wonderful time for us to remember the contributions of Venerable Master Hsing, and also a wonderful time for us to come together to discuss and talk about Buddhist studies together at the University of West. So thank you once again for this wonderful opportunity to be here. And my talk today will be on humanistic Buddhism in Singapore, and I'm grateful for this opportunity to share with you about a 100-year history of humanistic Buddhism in Singapore. And Yes told me that I have about 40 minutes, so you're going to learn about a century of humanistic Buddhism in just 40 minutes. And my talk today, I'm going to argue that there is no monolithic or single understanding of humanistic Buddhism. And as academics, we like to unpack things. We like to complicate things. So today, you're going to learn more about what are some of the ways that we can think about humanistic Buddhism. And in this case, humanistic Buddhism, with the scarecrow, to think about different ways to understand this concept of humanistic Buddhism in the context of Singapore. And I'm also going to point out that a way to understand humanistic Buddhism in this case, and I'm a historian of Buddhism, is to think about the different phases of humanistic Buddhism in the development of Buddhism in East Asia, but also in Southeast Asia. And in the Singapore context, I argue that we can understand the history and development of humanistic Buddhism in 3 phases. All right, so this is I'm going to give a quick overview of my lecture this afternoon. First, I'm going to give you a quick, brief history of Buddhism in Singapore. So just a quick show of hand. How many of you here have been to Singapore? Like, oh, wow. That's wonderful. All right. All right. So you're probably familiar with the Malayan, which has absolutely nothing to do with Buddhism. All right. And I'm going to talk about the 3 phases of humanistic Buddhism. So I will start first with Tai Hsi's human life Buddhism. I'm sure many of you here, if you are familiar with the history of modern Chinese Buddhism, you probably have heard of Master Tai Hsi. And I'm going to argue that Master Tai Hsi's idea of human life Buddhism, or Renshen Foujiao, can be understood as a kind of proto-humanistic Buddhism, especially in the context of Singapore. And next, I will talk about Venerable Yan Pei's idea of humanistic Buddhism, or Renshen Foujiao, in Singapore. And finally, I will discuss the expansion and development of humanistic Buddhist organization in contemporary Singapore from the 1980s to the present. So first, let me talk a bit about Singapore to give you a bit of an idea about the history of Buddhism in Singapore, also to contextualize my talk. So Singapore, as some of you might be familiar, was a British colony. So in 1819 is an important year in Singapore's history, and because that was the year where the British arrived. And first, this is a statue of Stamford Raffles. And very often for students of history, of my generation, we actually learn about Raffles as the quote-unquote the founder of modern Singapore. And of course, this has been kind of complicated in recent years, where how the Singapore state narrative has kind of extended to the 13th or 14th century to kind of a more of a decolonial kind of Singapore kind of history. But nevertheless, it's important to think about Singapore's colonial past and the development of Buddhism, which is a very interesting kind of connection that not many people are aware of. This was because after Singapore became a British colony, when the British came to Singapore, Raffles and of course the British administrator wanted to make Singapore a port city. And when the British first arrived, Singapore was actually more of a fishing village. So because of that, to expand Singapore into a port city, Raffles and the British administrator needed more migrant workers to work in the port. So because of that, this contributed to a mass wave of migration from China, but also from South and Southeast Asia to Singapore. And this migration contributed to the spread and arrival of Buddhism in the colonial port city. So first, we have Chinese migrants, including my ancestors from the southern coastal provinces of China, mainly Fujian and Guangdong provinces. They migrated from South China to Singapore, and they brought their religious belief and practices with them as they crossed the South China Sea. And there were also South and Southeast Asian migrants from mainland Southeast Asia, as well as from South Asia, and they brought their religious belief and practices with them across the Indian Ocean and South China Sea, and actually contributed to the arrival of Theravada Buddhism. So the Chinese migrants brought the Chinese belief and practices, but also brought Buddhism to Southeast Asia. So this is a map of Chinese migration, the Chinese in Southeast Asia. So most of the Chinese were from the southern provinces of Fujian and Guangdong over here, and they crossed the South China Sea to various parts of Southeast Asia. And of course, Singapore is right here. And because of its strategic location between the South China Sea and the Indian Ocean, and this was the main reason why the British thought Singapore was such an important had such an important geographic location to be a port city in the Indian Ocean trade. And many Chinese migrated south to Southeast Asia and to Singapore, and they brought various forms of Chinese religious belief and practices with them. And of course, they brought Buddhism, Chinese Buddhism with them to Singapore. The early form of Buddhism that the Chinese migrants brought to them, to Singapore in the 19th century, is a form of Buddhism that what some scholars would consider folk or popular Buddhism. And this form of Buddhism, some scholars call the kind of a unity of the three teachings, or Sanjiao Heyi, which is kind of a mix of Buddhist practices along with Taoist traditions and also the Chinese rites of Confucius worship. So because of that, many Buddhists during this time, they worship the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas along with Chinese deities, and also engage in various forms of Chinese religious practices, including attending ceremonies and rituals, engaging in, like, for instance, divinations, fortune telling, and burning of joss paper. So this was the kind of Chinese religious practices that was very common among the Chinese migrants in Singapore during the 19th century. And many of them, they did not tell the difference between Buddhism, Taoism, or kind of Chinese popular practices. And many of them identify themselves as just like Buddhists in a very general sense. But of course, a very important kind of worship among those early Buddhist migrants was the kind of worship of Guanyin, and this actually contributed to the establishment of various important Guanyin temples in Singapore. And of course, one of the most prominent Guanyin temples in Singapore is the Waterloo Guanyin Dong Huju Temple, which is the most prominent Guanyin temple in Singapore. And the Guanyin temple has also made many generous donations to the National University of Singapore. In fact, one of my close colleagues, Professor Kenneth Dean, is the Guanyin Dong professor of Chinese religion. So gradually, by the turn of the 20th century, we see the gradual shift from folk Buddhism to institutional Buddhism in Singapore. And this had a lot to do with the arrival of missionary monks in Southeast Asia. And many of these migrant monks were were not only interested in propagating the Dharma, but they wanted to reside in Singapore to propagate Buddhism. So this contributed to the gradual establishment of various forms of Buddhist monasteries in Singapore. And so several prominent Buddhist temples were established by the Chinese migrant monks, including the Xiongling Temple, which is the oldest Chinese Buddhist temple in Singapore, or the Shuangling Si. And the Hokkien migrant monks also gradually arrived and established a number of Buddhist temples, including the Longshan Si, the Longshan Si Monastery, the Poto Si, the Putuo Si. And the largest Buddhist temple was established in 1920 by Venerable Zhuangdao, and that was the Gongming Sampoka Si Monastery. And that is the largest Buddhist temple in Singapore. So there's also a common joke among Singaporean Buddhists, because for those who are familiar with Chinese Buddhism, they always talk about the 4 sacred mountains, right? The 四大名山. And for those who are familiar with Taiwanese Buddhism, they always talk about the 4 major Buddhist mountains, right? Including Foguangshan, Fagushan. So what san do we have in Singapore? So Singapore Buddhists say, oh, we have Guangming San, which is a very, very, is the largest temple in Singapore, but it's very small in a way if we compare that by the size of Buddhist monastery that we see in other parts of the world. All right, so now let us move to look at examine the first phase of the humanistic Buddhism in Singapore. So I'm going to say a few words about Master Taishi that I believe some of you are very familiar with. So Master Taishi was one of the most prominent Buddhist reformers in modern Chinese history. He was born in 1890 in Zhejiang province, and he became a novice in Jiangsu. And after that, he received his higher ordination at the Tiantong Monastery in Ningbo. So Master Taishi was a student of Master Jichan, and he was also classmates with other prominent Buddhist monastics, including Hui Xuan, who was the founder of the Mingnan Buddhist Institute, that I'm going to talk more about later, as well as Yuan Ying, and they all received their monastic training under the tutelage of Master Jichan. And subsequently, Taishi also studied under prominent Buddhist educator Yang Wenhui and Su Mansu at the Jetavana Vihara in Nanjing. And that was a very important, prominent center for Buddhist studies during this time. With the establishment of the Republic of China in 1912, Taishi spearheaded the Buddhist revival movement, or the Fojiao Fuxing Yundong, his attempt to propagate the Buddha Dharma, but also to promote Buddhist education. And this was something that Master Taishi was very concerned about, was about the lack of monastic training among the younger generation of monastics. So because of that, in 1922, Taishi founded the Wuchang Buddhist Studies Academy. And if you are interested to learn more about the Wuchang Buddhist Studies Academy, please read Venerable Rongdao's forthcoming book. And Venerable Rongdao is the leading expert on the area of Buddhist education in modern China. So Taishi established and founded this Wuchang Buddhist Studies Academy, which became a very important center for Buddhist studies. Although the academy did not last for a very long time, he actually produced a younger generation of Buddhist monastics. And in 1923, Master Taishi became the inaugural president of the World Buddhist Fellowship. But Taishi had this vision of promoting the ecumenical vision of uniting Buddhist communities around the world. And he believed that a World Buddhist Fellowship would be important for him to unite the Buddhist community in the revival of Buddhism in Republican China, but also in other parts of the world. And in 1927, Taishi succeeded his schoolmate, who was a Venerable Hui Xuan. Venerable Hui Xuan was the abbot of the Nanputo Monastery in Xiamen, which was a very prominent center for Buddhism in southern China, and was the founder of the Mingnan Buddhist Institute, or Mingnan Foshui. And if I remember correctly, Song taught there for a few years at the Mingnan Buddhist Institute, and it's one of the most prominent Buddhist academy in southern China. And in 1927, Taishi became the abbot of the Nanputo Monastery and director of the Mingnan Institute. And during this time, he promoted this vision of human life Buddhism, or Renshen Fojiao, which he believed was a kind of a remedy for Chinese Buddhism. And according to Taishi, during this time, during the late Qing and the early Republican period, he thought that Chinese Buddhism was in a way corrupt, in a sense that the Buddhist community placed too much emphasis on death and conducting funeral rites that he thought was not the way to advance Buddhism into the modern era. So because of that, Taishi believed that this idea of human life Buddhism could be a remedy to solve the problems of Chinese Buddhism during this time. So he advocated for a vision of modern Buddhism that was beyond death, funeral rites, and also the so-called otherworldly salvation, and wanted to change this image of Buddhism and the Buddhism as a religion for the living. And that's also the reason why he wanted to emphasize on this idea of the human life, focusing on the human and not on the dead. And he also sought to eradicate this so-called superstitious practices in Chinese Buddhism. And according to Taishi, these superstitious practices are those practices that he thought were considered uncanonical practices. That means those that are not in line with the Dharma, in line with the Buddhist scriptures. He wanted this Buddhism to be a rational modern religion that's based on the Buddhist scriptures. So this is his kind of vision of human life Buddhism. But more importantly, Taishi wanted to promote this utopian ideal of building, establishing a pure land in the human world, or building this kind of a Renjian Jingtu as his way to achieve this vision of human life Buddhism. And during Taishi's career, during his time as the rector of the Mingnan Buddhist Institute, and during the Sino-Japanese War, he actually made 3 visits to Singapore. First in 1926, and 1928, and 1948. And that was part of his global mission to promote his vision of human life Buddhism, but also his vision to achieve a kind of ecumenical kind of collaboration with other Buddhist communities. So Taishi actually traveled to Southeast Asia, and even to Europe to engage with other Buddhist communities, but also with other religious communities during this time. So Taishi came to Singapore in September 1926 and gave a series of talks at the Victoria Memorial Hall. So for some of you who are familiar with Singapore, and if you visit the Victoria Memorial Hall, it is a very different place today. You can see, of course, a statue of Raffles in front of the Memorial Hall. But the Victoria Hall is also the concert hall for the Singapore Symphony Orchestra, right? So it's very hard to connect the Symphony Orchestra with Taishi's Dharma lecture, right? But back in the 1920s and during the colonial period, the Victoria Memorial Hall was also a very important space for important talks and lectures. And when Taishi came to Singapore, he was invited to give a series of lectures. And of course, that was the time where he had this opportunity to promote his vision of the Buddhist revival movement. But he also proposed the establishment of a lay Buddhist association in Singapore. And why was that the case? Because according to Taishi, that he believed that the Buddhist community had to reach out to the lay community in Singapore, to the overseas Chinese community in Singapore, because when he arrived in Singapore, and of course the form of Buddhism that actually was prominent during this time was a more monastic kind of tradition, where the institutional form of Buddhism was actually very much confined to the monasteries, while the lay Buddhists had very little contact with the monastics and had very little opportunity to learn the Dharma. And because of that, Taishi thought that it was very important to reach out to the lay Buddhists and therefore proposed the establishment of a lay Buddhist association. And this inspired a very prominent Buddhist, lay Buddhist, but also a prominent Chinese business elite and a community leader, Ning Da-yun, who was an overseas Chinese in Singapore. And of course, this is the picture of Ning Da-yun and him with the mortarboard, right? So it's quite rare, back then for Chinese to be like graduates during this time, because many of the Chinese migrants in Singapore during this time were actually mainly coolies or migrant workers. So Ning Da-yun was a very prominent Buddhist householder and a Chinese community leader. And he was very much inspired by Taishi's lecture, and therefore he worked with Venerable Zhuan Dao, the founder of the Gongmingshan Pogasi Monastery, to establish the first lay Buddhist organization in Singapore. And in 1927, he founded the Chinese Buddhist Association, or the Zhonghua Fojiao that is still around today in Singapore. And this is usually considered the oldest lay Buddhist organization in Singapore. And the Zhonghua Fojiao, or the Chinese Buddhist Association, became the first lay Buddhist organization, and it was actually located in Singapore's Chinatown. And of course, this was the place where most of the Chinese community resided in Singapore during the colonial period. And the Chinese Buddhist Association promoted the Buddhist Taishi's vision of the Buddhist revival movement in Singapore. And at the same time, it was also a very important space that promoted Buddhist education, where the lay Buddhist community could come to attend Buddhist lecture by Buddhist teachers. And also, it was also a space that offered welfare services for the migrant community. So it was a very important kind of place of gathering for the Chinese migrants during the colonial period. And Taishi also had this vision of uniting the Chinese Buddhist community in Southeast Asia. And he suggested the establishment of the Nanyang Buddhist Association, or the Nanyang Fojiao. He believed that regional Buddhist organization could connect the community in Southeast Asia, especially in maritime Southeast Asia, where Buddhism is considered kind of a minority religion in a Malay-Muslim region. So therefore, he proposed this idea of a Nanyang Buddhist Association to connect the Dutch East Indies, which was the present-day Indonesia, as well as British Malaya and Singapore, to form this regional hub and have Singapore as the kind of regional hub for Buddhist missionary activities in the region. However, his idea of a Nanyang Buddhist Association to connect the three maritime Southeast Asian states to international Buddhist networks was never materialized. But this was his idea of connecting the Buddhist community and also to make maritime Southeast Asia a center for learning Chinese Buddhism beyond China. And an important contribution of Taishi's visit was actually had a lot to do with his student, Hsing. Hsing was a student of Master Taishi, and in 1940, for some of you who are familiar with Chinese history, this was the time of the Sino-Japanese War. And in 1940, Taishi actually led a Buddhist delegate to visit other parts of the world to promote peace and to denounce the Japanese aggression during this time. And during this visit in 1940, Taishi actually invited his student, Hsing, along for his tour of Asian countries. So at the end of the tour, Taishi actually returned back to China. But Hsing decided to stay in Southeast Asia because he thought that he wanted to promote the Dharma in maritime Southeast Asia. So Hsing established Buddhist institutions and schools in Singapore. So he actually founded the Lingfeng Buddhist Institute, or the Lingfeng Pudi Xueyuan, and also monastic dormitories or Fa Shi Liao for traveling monks in the region. And also he established the Maha Buddhist School, or the Puti Xuexiao, which is still around today, is the first Buddhist public school in Singapore. And he also contributed to the expansion of the Porte School, or the Puti Xuexiao in Penang, and the Puti Xuexiao in Singapore and the Puti Xueyuan in Penang are like sister institutions. And we see how this idea of Buddhist revival movement have contributed to the establishment of secular schools in maritime Southeast Asia. So these schools are in a way modeled very much after the kind of Christian missionary school, in the sense that although on the one hand, these were schools established by religious religious teachers, but on the other hand, there are also secular schools that offer secular subjects, and also today the Maha Bodhi School is a part of the public schools under the Singapore's Ministry of Education. And so this is the image picture of Taishi and Hsing in Singapore in 1940. And as you can see over here, there is Master Taishi, and next to over here, there is Venerable Hsing. And you can see Venerable Hsing, he actually was a Buddhist scholar who was not only well-versed in the Chinese Mahayana Buddhism, he just spent years learning Theravada Buddhism. And that also explains why he was actually dressed in Theravada robes in the picture. And right next to him is Venerable Zhuan Dao, who is the founder of the Guangming Sampo Kasi in Singapore and a very prominent Buddhist teacher during this time. Right. And next, now let's move to the second phase, which is the time of Yen Pei. And Venerable Yen Pei was one of the most prominent socially engaged Buddhist monks in post-colonial Singapore. And Singaporeans usually consider him as a social worker, Buddhist scholar, and a prominent teacher. And he was a very prominent, prolific Buddhist scholar and social activist. In fact, Venerable Yen Pei published a 34-volume collected work known as the Di Guan Quanji, the collection of mindful contemplation. And then subsequently, he published a sequel that was like 12 volumes, right? So I don't think any academics can will produce that 34-volume work. But so Yen Pei was really, in a way, considered the most prominent Buddhist writer during this time. So Yen Pei was born in 1917 in Jiangsu, and he actually traveled south to Xiamen to be enrolled in the Mingnan Buddhist Institute. So he was a student of Taishi. And Yen Pei actually published a very fascinating autobiography known as The Confession of a Foolish Monk. In fact, 一个凡于生的告白. And it's fascinating to read his autobiography because he talked about how after he was ordained, his teacher actually wanted him to become the successor abbot of a monastery in Jiangsu, and he didn't want to do so. So in the middle of the night, he sneaked out of the temple and traveled south to be enrolled at the Mingnan Buddhist Institute. So it's a really fascinating historical account of not only his life and times, but also about Buddhism during the Republican period. So Yen Pei traveled south to Xiamen to be enrolled in the Mingnan Buddhist Institute, and where he had a chance to study with prominent Buddhist reformers, as I mentioned earlier, including Master Taishi and of course Venerable Hsing. And that was where he was very much influenced by the ideas of human life Buddhism. And subsequently, he had a chance to meet Master Ying Shun. And Master Ying Shun was a very prominent Buddhist teacher of modern Chinese Buddhism. And Master Ying Shun was a student of, in fact, Master Taishi, and he was a student and a graduate of the Mingnan Buddhist Institute many years, not that many, about 10 years before Venerable Yen Pei. So he's an alum of the institute. And after he graduated from the Mingnan Buddhist Institute, Master Ying Shun was teaching in various parts of China. And of course, because of Master Taishi's connection, he actually connected Yen Pei with Ying Shun. And during this time, Ying Shun was a very prominent teacher. And of course, for scholars of modern Chinese Buddhism, you're probably familiar that in Ying Shun is very often known as the Dao Shi of modern Chinese Buddhism. So Chinese Buddhists usually call him 应顺导师 because of his role and contribution to promoting this idea of humanistic Buddhism, but also he was a very prominent Buddhist scholar during this time. So Master Ying Shun actually was very much influenced by Taishi's idea of human life Buddhism, but he furthered this idea of human life Buddhism by going back to history, and in this case, going back to early Indian Buddhism. And according to Master Ying Shun, he actually claims that Buddhism in early India actually had degenerated when it became assimilated with kind of theistic religious tradition. And according to Master Ying Shun, he believed that humanistic Buddhism actually existed since the time of the Sakyamuni Buddha. So therefore, it's important to go back to Buddhist history to discover this idea of humanistic Buddhism. So therefore, Master Ying Shun argued that how a human should practice the Dharma and strive to achieve Buddhahood in the human world, just like the Sakyamuni Buddha. Because since the Sakyamuni Buddha came to the human world to attain enlightenment, so therefore humans should actually practice the Dharma in the human world and to achieve enlightenment. Master Ying Shun's vision of humanistic Buddhism was that how humans should aspire to practice the Buddhist Sattva path or the Pusa Dao of the so-called great vehicle of Dachen. And to him, this is actually a platform to eventually enter what he considered the Buddha vehicle or the Fochen. So as he pointed out, his very prominent work, The Way to Buddhahood or 成佛之道, Master Ying Shun highlighted this idea of the uniqueness of the Mahayana or the Dachen Bugongfa, how Buddhists should strive to practice the Bodhisattva path of the great vehicle and eventually enter the Buddha vehicle as a way to achieve enlightenment. So this was his idea of humanistic Buddhism. And this was the time where Venerable Yanpei had the chance to actually learn from Master Ying Shun, and he was actually very much greatly inspired by his idea of humanistic Buddhism. I'm going to show you this very short video clip of this oral history interview of Venerable Yanpei talking about how he met Master Ying Shun because of Master Taishi. So, Venerable Yanpei studied with Master Ying Shun at the Sino-Tibetan Institute, and that was actually in Sichuan. And Sino-Tibetan Institute was a very prominent center for Buddhist studies in southwest China during this time, and was actually established by another prominent student of Master Taishi, and this Venerable Fa Jun. And that was the time where he had a chance to actually learn from Master Ying Shun. And in 1949, with the establishment of the People's Republic of China, a number of prominent Chinese monks in mainland China decided to move to Taiwan with the Kuomintang government. And it was during this time that Yanpei and Ying Shun actually left mainland China, first for Hong Kong and subsequently to Taiwan. And Yanpei and Ying Shun actually, so Yanpei was actually in fact one of the founding members of the Fuyan Vihara that Ying Shun established in Hsinchu in Taiwan. And this is an image of the Fuyan Vihara. And over here you can see Master Ying Shun with Venerable Yanpei, and guess what? Venerable Master Hsing Yun over here in the picture, and they were actually actively promoting Buddhism in Taiwan during this time. And between 1957 and 1960, Venerable Yanpei became the abbot of the Sandao Monastery in Taipei. And Sandao Monastery is one of the very prominent Chinese Buddhist temples in Taiwan. And in fact, there's a subway station that is a Sandao Monastery if you have a chance to visit. And when Yan Pei was the abbot of the Sandao Monastery, actually he received many invitations from the Chinese Buddhist community in Southeast Asia to teach. And because of that, he accepted the invitation and actually made 3 visits to give Dharma talks in Southeast Asia, both in mainland Southeast Asia. He went to Thailand, Laos, and Cambodia, but also visited Vietnam, Singapore, and Malaysia in the late 1950s and early 1960s. And during this time, he had very close relationship with the Chinese Buddhist community in Vietnam. Actually thought of migrating to Vietnam. But because of the Vietnam War, Yan Pei could not go to Vietnam. And his good friend, Venerable Chia in Singapore, convinced him to migrate to Singapore. And because of that, eventually, Yan Pei accepted the invitation and migrated to Singapore in 1964. Yan Pei's religious career in Singapore can be divided into 2 phases. The first phase was the abbot of the Ling Feng Prajna Auditorium. And as I mentioned earlier, Ling Feng was actually established by Venerable Hsing in 1940. And after Hsing actually left Singapore, he actually went to Taiwan. Ling Feng Prajna, back then was known as the Ling Feng Buddhist Institute, was kind of in the decline because of the lack of a very prominent Buddhist teacher. And Venerable Chia convinced Venerable Yan Pei to actually become the abbot and to revive the Ling Feng Buddhist Institute. So then he accepted the invitation and became the abbot. And he changed the name to of the Ling Feng Buddhist Institute to the Ling Feng Prajna Auditorium, or the Ling Feng Pura Jiangtang. The idea of having an auditorium was also kind of an innovative one during this time, because he thought that there were just so many Buddhist monasteries in Singapore, but he wanted a space that actually served as an auditorium where he could not only deliver Dharma lectures to the Buddhist community, but also invite traveling monks to come to speak to the Buddhist community. So he thought that the auditorium or the Jiangtang was a much more productive space to promote his vision of humanistic Buddhism. So Yan Pei was a very prominent Dharma teacher and promoter of humanistic Buddhism, and he renovated, expanded the Ling Feng Prajna Auditorium into a center for Buddhist education in Singapore. And also there was a time where he actually started the Sunday Dharma School program, right? This was also a very innovative program during this time, where he actually wanted to promote Buddhism and educate the younger generation of Buddhists in Singapore. And as the abbot of the Ling Feng Prajna Auditorium, he was also a very prolific teacher, and he also gave many Dharma talks. And it was during this time where his teacher, Master Ying Shun, actually convinced Venerable Yan Pei to put all his writings and his lectures together into a collection of essays, so that his work can be known not only to the Buddhist community in Singapore, but also to the Buddhist community in the region. And because of that, he decided to put his writing and compound his work together and produce a 34-volume collection of essays under the title Collected Works of Mindful Observation, or 地观全集. In the second phase of his religious career in the 1980s, Yan Pei became a Singapore citizen, and he actually saw the need for Buddhists to become socially engaged and contribute to society. And therefore, he established the Singapore Buddhist Welfare Services, or the Singapore 佛教福利协会. The Singapore Buddhist Welfare Services focus on 3 main areas that Yan Pei thought were very important in a gradually changing Singapore. And Singapore became an independent country in 1965, and it actually went through a period of rapid social political development under then Prime Minister Lee Kuan Yew, and gradually became one of the wealthiest countries in Southeast Asia. At the same time, Yan Pei thought that it's important that how the Buddhist organization could contribute to the changing society, and therefore he placed emphasis on these 3 main areas. First, elder care and filial responsibility. Second, organ donation and kidney dialysis. And third, drug prevention and rehabilitation. So I'm going to talk more about that. First, Yen Pei actually was very concerned with the welfare of poor and elderly Singaporeans during this time. Actually, and he argued that how Buddhism is a religion that actually places the utmost importance of filial piety, and as he put it, 佛教是最重视孝道的宗教, right? So, and therefore he actually led the Singapore Buddhist Welfare Services effort in public assistance, and the Singapore Buddhist Welfare Services offered many different social programs to help the poor and the needy in Singapore. And also in 1985, Yen Pei founded the Grace Lodge to provide shelter for homeless elderly that he thought was actually, they were kind of neglected by this social policy that actually, during this time, the Singapore government's policy was known as the Many Helping Hands approach. But the Many Helping Hands approach was actually based on the kind of model that actually that the government did not want Singapore to be a welfare state because that would be too costly, and therefore the government wanted social and religious organizations to contribute to social welfare, and that was when Yen Pei thought he could come in and contribute to support the poor and the needy, and therefore establish a home shelter for homeless elderly in 1985. At the same time, Yen Pei was also an active champion of organ donation, and this was one of the issues that was of concern in Singapore society during this time. And Yen Pei organized a kidney donation seminar and also a 5-day kidney care exhibition in 1983. And this was a time, in fact, in Singapore, although the government were actively promoting that, many Singaporeans were very reluctant to donate their organs because at that time there was this conception that if you donate your organ, right, your body will not be complete, and in your next life you might be missing like some organs. So because of that, Yen Pei wanted to correct this kind of misconception, and actually he used Buddhist ideas to advocate for the need for to advocate for the Buddhist community to consider donating their organs. And as he pointed out, and I quote here, Buddhism encourages all Buddhists to donate kidney or other useful internal organs to the sick. Buddhists should participate actively in the launching of kidney donation, unquote. So we can see how Yen Pei used this idea of a Buddhist compassion and giving in the context of organ donation, and this is something which is very interesting to note. And in 1992, he actually founded the first Buddhist kidney dialysis center, and that was a collaboration with the Singapore's National Kidney Foundation, and that was established in 1992, as you see over here, and that's Venerable Yen Pei. And this Singapore Buddhist Welfare Services National Kidney Foundation Dialysis Center is still very, very active in Singapore today, and in fact, the Venerable Yen Pei's successor actually collaborate with the National Kidney Foundation to establish the Venerable Yen Pei NKF Research Fund. So if you are conducting research on as you see over here, on kidney diseases, you can apply for this grant, right? I think it's up to $300,000, right, to support research. And it's interesting that how this grant can support, as you see over here, manpower, equipment, material, supplies, and miscellaneous. So it's a research grant that was established to support Venerable Yen Pei's work. And finally, last but not least, Venerable Yen Pei was very concerned with the problem of young drug addicts in the 1970s. And some of you might be familiar, Singapore has one of the strictest law against drugs in Asia. And there was a time in the 70s, it was actually drug addiction was a major problem in Singapore in the early years of Singapore's independence. And Venerable Yen Pei pointed out that Buddhists should be sympathetic to former drug addicts. And because of that, he actually established the Green Haven in 1993, which was the first, but it remains the only Buddhist halfway house in Singapore. And the Green Haven aims to help former drug addicts and help them to return to the family and reintegrate into the society. And so Venerable Yanpei is extremely well loved by the Buddhist community in Singapore, and that's the poster of his 25th year anniversary memorial service, and he remains a very much well loved Buddhist leader in Singapore's Buddhist history. And now I'm moving on to the final phase, which is on humanistic Buddhism in contemporary Singapore. And I want to start by talking about this prominent work by my colleague, Hua Kun Eng. And Hua Kun Eng had published a very prominent work on Buddhism in Singapore, State, Society, and Religious Engineering towards a Reformist Buddhism in Singapore, as you see over here. And this prominent work actually argues, according to Professor Hua Kun Eng, she argues that how the Buddhicization of Chinese religious syncretism and the movement towards reformist Buddhism within the Chinese community in the 1980s, right, contributed to a transformation of the Buddhist community. And according to her, this shift can be seen in these 6 types of religious activities by Buddhist organizations in Singapore since the 1980s. And these include, according to her, propagating Buddhist scriptural knowledge to the public, encouraging general participation, cultivating reformist Buddhists, performing missionary works, putting faith in the real-life practice, and also legitimizing Vesak as a public holiday. And at the same time, many Buddhists, according to her, engage in charity and welfare work. And I want to build on her work and argue that how, in fact, to understand this reformist Buddhism in Singapore, we have to understand that how this actually had a lot to do with the development of humanistic Buddhism and how humanistic Buddhism shaped the kind of Chinese Buddhist community from the 1980s. And I want to do that by highlighting several prominent Buddhist organizations that arrived in Singapore and contributed to the expansion of the understanding of humanistic Buddhism. And many of this, in fact, all this organization came from Taiwan and also subsequently localized into Singapore's Buddhist society. I'm going to start by talking about this prominent organization known as the Mahaprajna Buddhist Society, or Huiyan Foshe Hui. And this was founded by Venerable Zhong, who was a disciple of Master Ying Shun. He studied at the Fuyan Vihara and the Hui Auditorium in Taiwan before coming to Singapore. And in 1985, he founded the Mahaprajna Buddhist Society, or the Huiyan Foshe Hui. According to Venerable Zhong, he actually pointed out that how that many temples in Singapore, although there were many devotees, but many Buddhists still did not make much distinction, as I mentioned earlier, between Buddhism and Taoism, or Buddha and the deity. So therefore, the Mahaprajna Buddhist Society hopes to serve as a platform, but also as a Buddhist educational center to promote humanistic Buddhism in Singapore. So the Mahaprajna Buddhist Society promoted this idea of humanistic Buddhism based on Master Ying Shun's The Way to Buddhahood. And they have a very, they produce a 3-year Dharma course curriculum to train Singaporean Buddhists based on Master Ying Shun's teachings of humanistic Buddhism. And this is the 3-year Dharma course curriculum. And in fact, you can even watch online. So they have already Venerable Zhong and the Mahaprajna Buddhist Society have uploaded the entire 3-year program onto YouTube, so you can attend this program virtually. And so the Mahaprajna Buddhist Society, of course, as a Buddhist organization, they are very active in a number of Buddhist Dharma activities, including, of course, Dharma talks and Dharma classes. But they were also active in a number of social cultural activities, and in fact, many of these activities are kind of secular in a way, including the charity, choir, fora, and arrangement, and Tai Chi classes, right? Yeah, and so it's very interesting to see this kind of connection between the kind of social cultural activities and also the kind of Buddhist activities that the Mahaprajna Society runs in Singapore. And this is the latest recruitment poster, the Dharma classes enrollment, and the deadline is July 31st, next month. So this is part of the, as I mentioned earlier, the 3-year Dharma course program. So your students will enroll in July, and then they will go through the program, the 3-year program. After they graduate for the program, then they can also enroll in some independent studies classes, and also before they can be qualified to become Dharma class teachers for the programs eventually. Yeah, so this is the kind of so-called talent building program that the Mahaprajna Society tries to develop. And of course, another organization that needs no introduction, of course, many of you are familiar with, is of course Fo Guang And Fo Guang Singapore is a very prominent Buddhist organization that promotes humanistic Buddhism in Singapore. In 1993, the Singapore chapter of the Buddha's Light International Association, or the Guoji Fo Guang Hui, was established to propagate the Dharma in Singapore. And in 1996, the Fo Guang Yuan Singapore was founded. And after the founding of Fo Guang Yuan, Venerable Master Hsing Yun regularly visited Singapore and offers Malaysia to propagate humanistic Buddhism. And in the year 2000, the Singapore Fo Guang Singapore was officially registered, and it was completed. And so this is the Fo Guang Singapore that you see today in October 2007, which is located in Punggol in the northeastern part of Singapore. The Fo Guang Singapore aims to be an educational institute, and I quote here, for the community and a sanctuary for spiritual cultivation in a journey to propagate humanistic Buddhism and develop a Buddha's Light Pure Land in Singapore. And Fo Guang Singapore focuses on 4 activities, right? First, to propagate the Dharma through culture. Second, foster talents through education. So Fo Guang Singapore actually offers a wide range of Dharma classes from kids all the way up to elderlies, right? So they have a range of Dharma programs for Buddhists of different age, and also benefit Dharma through charity, and also purify minds through Dharma services. And one of the flagship programs that I want to highlight that actually organized by Fo Guang Singapore is the Humanistic Buddhism Youth Forum. It's organized once every 2 years, and this year it will be held in November this year. And this is the photo of the in-person program in 2019, and yours truly is over here. And the one was held 2 years ago in 2011 in 2021 because of COVID. It was held online, so we had this youth forum virtual program that Fo Guang Singapore collaborated with Fo Guang Malaysia and also the University of Malaya to host this online program. And that's me over here, right? And the online program, and is Venerable Chia, who is the chief abbess of the Fo Guang San in Malaysia, Singapore, and Indonesia. Right? So, and she was the host of the youth forum. Yeah. So I'm going to show this short video clip. This it's a documentary that Fo Guang San produced to talk about the spread of Fo Guang San humanistic Buddhism to 5 continents around the world. And there's an episode on Singapore, right? I'm going to show you a very short clip that talks about that Singaporean leaders talk about Fo Guang San's contribution to humanistic Buddhism in Singapore. I'll show you here. And this Venerable Master Hsing Yun with Singapore's Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong. And Singapore Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong speech at All right, so hope you have a chance to visit Fo-guang-san Singapore or participate in the Humanistic Buddhism Youth Forum later this year. Right? And last but not least, some other prominent humanistic Buddhist organization in Singapore include Chiji. For instance, Chiji Singapore is also a very prominent Buddhist organization in Singapore, registered in September 1993, the same year as Fo-guang-san, and they established an island-wide network of volunteers in Singapore, and they focus on sharing the Dharma, but as well as conducting philanthropic activities and promoting recycling in Singapore. And in 2019, the Chiji Humanistic Youth Center was established and opened in Yishun, the northern part of Singapore. And another prominent organization is the Dharma Drum Singapore, or Fa Gu San Singapore Hu Fa Hui, was established in 1996. And the Dharma Drum Singapore focuses on promoting Venerable Hsing Yin's vision of Chinese Chan Dharma Drum Buddhism, or Zhonghua Chan Fa, Zhonghua Chan Fa Gu Zhong, and the emphasize on promoting this mind life and environment protection, as well as offering a number of meditation classes and also meditation retreat in Singapore. So it's also important to note that these are some of the prominent prominent Buddhist organizations that promote humanistic Buddhism in Singapore. But at the same time, it's also important to note that there are many other organizations in Singapore that also promote humanistic Buddhism, but also offer the kind of localized vision of humanistic Buddhism as well. So it's important to unpack and also to understand that how humanistic Buddhism in not only in Singapore but also in different parts of the world is not a monolithic a Buddhist idea or vision. In fact, we have to understand the kind of diversity and the kind of various forms of humanistic Buddhism that coexist, and how various humanistic Buddhist organizations collaborate, but at the same time promote their various different forms of Buddhist ideas, right? So I'm going to conclude my lecture today by going back to what I've talked about, this 100-year of humanistic Buddhism in Singapore. So it's a way to think about this development, the history and development of humanistic Buddhism, is to see how this idea of humanistic Buddhism has developed. First, we have Master Tai Hsu's idea of human life Buddhism in the form of proto-humanistic Buddhism, and how this form of Buddhism has contributed to the establishment of new Buddhist institutions, arrival of Buddhist monks, and new forms of Buddhist activities in Singapore. And then gradually we see how the arrival of Venerable Yan Pei and other forms of humanistic Buddhist organization expanded our understanding, expanded the various different forms of humanistic Buddhism in global city Singapore. And at the same time, we also have to be mindful about how humanistic Buddhist organization, although it's a Buddhist idea that was first emerged in mainland China during the Republican period, and then spread to Taiwan, and of course, and how these ideas were brought to not only to Southeast Asia, to Singapore, but also to various parts of the world. It's also important to identify and think about the localization of humanistic Buddhist organizations. And of course, learn so much about the localization of humanistic Buddhism from Ian's fascinating book that looks at humanistic Buddhism in other parts of the world. And I'm very fascinated by the case of Africa, right? How humanistic Buddhism arrived in Africa and then it localized. And this is also the case in Singapore as well. It's important to think about the localization of humanistic Buddhist organization. And last but not least, I think an area of potential research for further research is to consider the impact and the long-term development of humanistic Buddhism in Singapore. But not only in Singapore, but different parts of the world, that how humanistic Buddhism is not something that is static. It's actually something that's always changing, and it's always important to think about this long-term development and also how the Buddhist community respond to various forms of humanistic Buddhism, and also at the same time, how humanistic Buddhism changed in the local context, and also and also due to various forms of social political changes in various different settings. So with that, I will conclude my lecture here. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions and comments. Thank you.